Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us again this evening for another episode of Through My Eyes with Professor Bolaji Akinyemi. Before we go on, we want to thank you all for all the support online, for the comments, for those of you who have followed across all the different channels. We thank you for your time and joining us in these sessions every week. Some of you have described it as informative, educative, keeping memories, and please keep coming. We want to encourage you to share the links. We're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, it's also on a Twitter page as well. So please do share this across whatever channels you can see this on, and it's also live on Instagram as well. So for those of you who prefer Instagram, we are live across a number of all these channels. So thank you for joining this evening. Thank you, Prof, for being here again, all the way from Nigeria.
Thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, or good day to wherever you may be as one of our member of one of our audiences.
Fantastic. All right, today we've got some really interesting questions. Do remember you can send questions in or contribute to the session on any of the channels that I mentioned, and I will pass those directly to the Prof, and he can respond to your questions from there. So we're starting off today with China. Let's go all the way to China. Prof, we continue to see tensions increasing, and we see a number of countries continue to bring some form of sanctions, I would say, against China in terms of consulates being closed. Where do you see this developing into?
Well, I think for the past 2 months or so, we have seen indications that a Cold War was brewing between China on one hand and the rest of the world on the other hand, not just against one country. The way, as a scholar, what baffles me is who is advising the Chinese? Why are the Chinese developing a hostile relationship with almost everybody? If you recall, this problem on Hong Kong with this problem on border matches India, they have this problem with the Americans on COVID-19, and now on, well, attempt, at least that's the allegation, attempt to steal the vaccine secrets in the United States, and problem again with the British over hacking into some strategic and sensitive machinery. Don't also forget that they earlier had problems, which they still have, with Africans. In fact, the problem with Africans was two-pronged. One had to deal with what I would call neo-colonial economic relations and economic agreements which they had drawn up with African countries. And the second prong had to be the treatment of Africans in China itself. So I ask myself, why are the Chinese pursuing a diplomacy that has made them enemies all over the world? It's not just against one country. I recall a time in the 70s and probably going on to maybe 80s, mid-80s, mid-90s, when the Chinese were just coming in globally onto the world global scene. And the Chinese promised that they were not going to make the same mistake of the United States or the Western countries in becoming a bully on the global scene, that they were going to use soft diplomacy, they were going to conduct themselves in such a way that they will not make enemies for themselves. What happened that we've now got to this stage where they have practically made enemies of the whole world against themselves? They've become assertive. They have problems in the South China Sea in terms of where the boundary of the sea lies, creating artificial islands in the South China Sea. Why? Why are they doing? A good diplomat does not, like a good soldier, does not fight too many wars on different fronts at the same time. Well, China seems to have forgotten the lessons of some of his brightest and best diplomats, which they had much earlier on when China came into the global scene. But
But
it spelled problems for the Chinese, and it spells problems for the rest of the world as well, because China keeps saying we will retaliate for whatever negative measures are mounted against us. When the Americans decided to close down the Chinese consulate, remember what the allegation was, that the Chinese were using that consulate to steal American intellectual property. As the Chinese replied, if you do so, we will retaliate.
yeah.
When the British decided to grant asylum to about 3 million people from Hong Kong, it was a threatening response. We will retaliate. I'm not sure it's going to do anybody much good.
But is this because China has now developed a capability that makes them believe they don't really need some of these other countries they have these relationships with?
No, you do. You do need relationships on a mutual global basis. But you are right that China may now perceive herself as actually be a global power. Before we used to talk about an ascending global power. It might actually now decide that it has got to that stage where in any conflict she will come up tops. This is dangerous. I cannot overstress this, Mr. Moderator. I cannot overstress this. The most dangerous time for the world in terms of world peace is when an ascending power decides to challenge a status quo power and think that, well, it can take on the world and it will win the conflict. This is what Germany did in the First World War. This is what Germany did in the Second World War. And by the time Germany realized that it couldn't win the war, even though it had built up itself into a major power, millions of lives have been lost. I hope that nobody is going to make the mistake of allowing this series of conflicts to become militarized.
On one hand, though, Prof, wouldn't we say that the the war has just taken on a different face? Maybe we're not getting bombers flying from one place to the other, but there seems to be another type of electronic war that is progressing at a very fast pace.
I'm sorry, I think we have a problem with sound.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, so the question was this, still on China, that even though we're not seeing military planes flying out there, but we could say that a war has actually broken out on a slightly different plane in terms of the cyber war that we're beginning to see. What do you have to say to that?
Well, yes, I mean your perception is accurate, but I will say that conflicts usually start on economic basis, on cultural basis, and now electronic basis. And then somebody gets angry and decides that he will actually put a stop to all this irritation by going militarily, because nations, I mean, China and the United States are still busy building planes and ships and what have you. But it's not electrofia is new. From the diplomacy that we know of, diplomats have always been trying to steal the secrets of other countries. That's what you know, and use those secrets to undermine themselves. And that's what we in the old days, that's what we call propaganda. Propaganda warfare. You know, what you didn't do, they say you did it. What you didn't say, they say you say, and then what they said they would deny, and it becomes propaganda warfare. Now, instead of people actually going in to steal papers on which those things are written, it has become hacking. We call it hacking now, electronic warfare. But it's not new. That's number one. That's the first point I would like to make. It's not new. The second point is everybody does it. Everybody does it. Number three, we from the developing countries have been the victims of electronic hacking, propaganda warfare, hacking into our cables since independence. But it's just now that the usual culprits are now becoming victims, that it is now on the pages of the newspaper. They are now screaming about interfering in the election of each other. Well, they've been interfering in our elections, for donkey years. One of the things which I found amusing about WikiLeaks was that it finally gave me and gave scholars from developing countries opportunities to read the diplomatic cables of developed countries, whereas they've been reading our cables, they've been breaking our own diplomatic codes since the 60s. Whom will we complain to in any case? But now that they are victims, they are publicizing the electronic warfare.
So, Prof, on that point you raised there, so are you saying that it was beneficial for some of these cables that were released to be released?
Beneficial to who?
To us in developing countries.
No. Beneficial is not the word that I will use, because there was nothing we could do about it anyway, even after we are aware of some of the duplicities in those. There was still do about it, but at least we were able to front diplomats and say, we told you that this and this and this are the things which they have been doing against us. They've been interfering in our elections, at times openly, at times subterraneously. They've been giving money to opposition parties, or at times to government parties, depending on who they were backing. But now that you have a country that has the capability to do it to them, they are screaming, blue murder.
Now, one thing that's happened, and you talked about propaganda there, and I want to drill in on that point a little bit, because we see the advent of fake news, and we see that all over the place now, and people need to verify every form of information, which is a good thing in itself. But do you see the trend getting worse over time, and what is the impact of this on diplomacy?
It complicates matters. It makes diplomacy just that more complex, and it is devious. There is an illustration which I will give without mentioning names. Sometimes in the 60s, a radio belonging to one of ours carried a false news that massacre of one ethnic group was taking place in a particular area. When that radio broadcast that, there was retaliation, and that led to genocide, and that led to a civil war in which probably about 3 million people died. It was after the war that we then discovered that the radio itself was fake, and that the news that people were being massacred was fake. Now you could see the cost of that fake news. It is still happening today. Some of the fake news, so obvious that it is fake, that you could laugh it off. But others have the consequence of affecting your elections. During the last election in the United States, there were fake videos put out showing either blacks rioting in a white area in the United States to influence white voters to vote for one party of the choice of whoever was putting out these fake videos. And yet it was all fake. In fact, some of the films were made in Russia, and they pretended that it was happening on the streets of the United States. It's dangerous. It's a dangerous game that is being played. And the consequences really means that the will of the people becomes difficult to ascertain. What is really the true will of the people if their electoral behavior has not been conditioned by fake news?
Now let's bring that to Africa. Are we seeing the rise of such fake news in Africa as well, and from African leaders, more importantly? Because we know that in the United States, for example, the president has been censored a number of times on some of the media channels, on social media particularly. Are you seeing that trend in Africa as well from the leaders?
No, I am not. I am not. But now that you mention it, I will start to pay attention. I haven't seen a pattern, let me put it that way. Politicians lie. Politicians will tell you they've built a bridge where there is no river. And when you point that out to them, they then tell you that they will put a river under the bridge. So politicians make these promises, campaign promises, but which are not evil. I think it is when the motive behind behind fake news leads to unconscionable behavior by the electorate that it comes to one's attention. But that a politician tells lies about the opposite side. Oh, that's what they do all the time. So, to that extent, politics in Africa is not different. But the volume and the effect of fake news by African leaders is not one that has registered on my radar.
Okay. While we're still on this point, the UK government, after about 18 months, eventually released this parliamentary report on Russian interference. What do you say to the length of time it took to release the report, number one? And number two, the fact that a lot of the substance that maybe people wanted to hear was not released in the report on the grounds of national security.
Well, the British have perfected the art of commissions which are put in place to allow emotions to calm down while issues are still burning and people's emotions are still high. They put in that committee. It takes its time. In fact, by the time it files its report, people have even forgotten maybe what the issue was all about. But by the time the report comes out, it's like, well, we knew anyway, and now let us move on. The British have perfected that art. I used to call it the art of the Royal Commission, which means we don't know what to do about it. We don't want to do anything about it. So let's push it to a commission that will then tell us what to do about it long after nobody really cares about the issue. And from what you said, that on the grounds of national security, a lot of issues have been blacked out. I'm not surprised. Government will always use the concept of national security.
One point here, Prof, in the report. I've got a copy of the report.
Developments and
I've got a copy of the report in front of me here, Prof. And one of the things it talked about, and can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Well, you are echo and yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I was saying that I have a copy of that report in front of me here. And one of the things it talked about was building this offensive cyber capability. We talked about that already, but I want to look at it from a slightly different angle and get your view on this. And what the report says is that historically, governments in the UK government, US, never used to call out countries. What do you think to that trend?
You mean that they are now naming?
They are now naming perpetrators.
Either the countries in the West actually now know that they don't have the capability to interrupt this interference electronic warfare, that they now think that the best thing is to raise an alarm about it so that their people become aware of it. It's been going, as I said earlier, it's been going on for quite a while. They probably have mounted, they've developed countermeasure in order to block the effect of it. But now it's happening at such a scale, in such a volume, that frankly, no country has the capability to interrupt it, to block it off. And that therefore, the strategy is just to make it open, make the knowledge open that this is what Russia is doing. And now putting, if you like, putting the option on the citizens to be careful, to be aware that it is a target of electronic warfare. If you cannot, I mean, they will still continue to try to fight it, but if you are not going to be successful at blocking it off, you might as well let the people know what is going on.
Okay, before we move away from that topic, do you see any African nation becoming a force to reckon with when it comes to an offensive cyber capability?
In terms of talent, we do have Africans who could put in place this offensive electronic capability. But the nature of our political system is such that we regard ourselves as our enemies rather than foreign governments. And so to that extent, African countries are not interested in building up a counter electronic capability directed at non-African countries. It will be more to spy on each other at home and to create problems for each other at home, in which case they will even be using foreign countries as allies in the domestic war. And that's also, it is the system that has driven a lot of African brains abroad. You'll find them in, some of the institutions that are actually developing these counter intelligence programs in the other parts of the world, in the United States, in Britain, in France. You will find Africans there because they are not needed. They are not used in their own home country. There's nothing that prevents them from having that capability. I mean, look, even though it's not an issue you have raised, but what happened 2 days ago? United Arab Emirates sent a rocket, satellite, to Mars. Now, UAE became independent only 50 years ago. Most African countries became independent about 60 years ago. What have they done in terms of developing a space program? If UAE can do it, why can't Nigeria do it?
But someone could ask, Prof,
Yes.
someone could ask this, and I've had this argument a lot of times, and it would be good to hear your response. To say that the Nigerian problem is not a go-to-mass problem. The Nigeria problem is, what are we going to eat? Where are we going to live? What infrastructure are we going to have? And the fact that when a lot of programs like this are set up, the money ends up going into private pockets.
Well, you are raising two different issues. The first issue is that the stage of our development is such that we should simply bother our heads about what we should eat and what we should drink and what latest fashion we will wear. When Africans are busy importing latest bottles of champagne in the largest volume, which Nigeria used to do at one time, nobody made that kind of complaint. When we were buying the latest version of lace materials or the latest version of what's this you use in tiles for building houses, while we were busy building castles and enormous mansions, nobody talked about this. But when we now want to put in a program that will be a legacy for the black race, that is when I then start hearing this kind of, man should not live by bread alone. Doesn't mean that man is not hungry, but man should not live by bread alone. Spend your resources on things that will leave a legacy for your children, a legacy for your race. That's what we're talking about. Do you think the United Arab Emirates has finished solving its developmental problems? Is there no poverty in the United States? And yet they've gone to the moon. They have a sophisticated space program. Is there no poverty in Russia? And yet they've gone also into space. So why are you asking Africans to finish its developmental programs first in terms of infrastructure before they're having a space program? The second issue you've raised, to which I have to concede, is that even if you have the program, they will steal the money. The issue of corruption in Africa is so humongous that really one should bow one's head in shame when you hear the figures that are coming out in the different probes, that whether the probe is done by, whether the report is by the World Bank or the IMF or even the domestic parliament, you won't believe that it is possible to run such a corrupt system. You won't believe it. But then most of the money that is stolen is where? Abroad. Remember what an African president once said to a British prime minister when he accused his country of humongous corruption. He said, just return the money that they stole and kept in your banks. Return that to me and let us move on.
Yeah, wow. Okay. That's a very important point, because again, on this matter of corruption, just before we leave that point, we're also seeing cases of corruption in the UK, in the US, and other countries as well. Do you think that the case we're hearing in Africa, yes, we know about the numbers are high, but do you think this is another case of painting the African scenario much worse than we're painting what is happening here in the UK or in the US?
No. I wouldn't put it that way. I wouldn't even go that way at all. I think the differences between corruption in the Western countries and corruption in Africa is that in the Western countries, if you are caught, you go to jail. If you are caught, you go to jail. So there are lots of people who don't get caught and who benefit from corruption. In fact, you cannot have a corrupt African leader without a foreign partner. You cannot have a corrupt African politician without a foreign partner. It works both ways. Number two, corruption in the Western countries is on a scale that leaves enough left for development or allocation to programs on which they have practice. Whereas corruption in Africa is at such a scale that there is nothing left for meaningful development.
Yeah, someone is just supporting your point here, saying that if a development department can openly say for 33 years of establishment, the only thing they have to show is technology for Kilishi, which I understand is a local sort of snack. Yes. It says, shouldn't their budget have gone to develop the kind of technology that you're talking about here?
Yeah.
All right.
There is another illustration. I know of an African country that set up a defense industry at the same time that Brazil set up its own defense industry. And all that African defense industry, I'm not mentioning the name of the country, has succeeded in doing, first of all, manufacturing furniture, household furniture, as if we didn't have carpenters. And then finally, it is now manufacturing guns, AK-47s and so on. Brazil has manufactured Embraer aircraft, tanks, fighter jet planes, and yet they were set up at the same time. So it's lack of seriousness, lack of a vision. They haven't made up their mind as to what the vision of development should be.
Okay, while we're in Africa and talking about this Africa point, there is a point that's been raised here around how the black race identify themselves, and this sense that anything that's not good tends to be black, and anything that's good tends to be white, or something along those lines. What do you have to say to that sort of categorization of black and white?
It's very upsetting. It really is upsetting. But whoever sent him that question is absolutely right. Whenever there's something that is undesirable, the term black is used for it. I can only think of one exception, and that is when your bank balance is in credit, then you balance it in the but when your bank balance is in deficit, they don't say it is white, they say it is red. Your account is in the red. So to that extent, I wonder myself, how did it come to be that anything negative anything undesirable, the term black is attached to it. Rather than bemoan the fact that that's the situation, I think the question we simply should ask is, what do we do about it? And to me, I think we should simply have legislation. I mean, we have legislation against hate speech. As you rightly pointed out, I think at the beginning of this program or somewhere along the line, that some of the social media platforms are now taking down fake news. Where I think also there should be legislation that makes it an offense to use the term black to apply to something abusive, undesirable, unwanted, ugly. We should have legislation against that. It's something that we will have to have a deliberate policy to take down. It's so ingrained. Black Friday, Black Monday, your football team loses, and so it's a black day, in that county because their football team lost the match. People don't be, they are not even aware that that is racist. It's as simple as that.
One area we see this thing going, Prof, and I think for some it might be very confusing as to what we expect them to be called, is when you look at the term African American. That's also being used there in the United States. In the United Kingdom, we have something that is called BAME. And these are terminologies that for some people makes no sense outside of the United Kingdom. But they have become the norm for the ease of communication. Where do you draw the line?
Well, the American one I have heard, about it. I haven't had the United Kingdom one. I don't even know what it means. We've moved now into an area that is going to, it needs a lot of thought. Let's do a fast historical sketch of the United States. There was a time they were called Negroes, and they objected to that. Then they were called blacks, and they said, why should we be called blacks as a group when you just refer to the others as Americans? You don't call them white. So we don't want to be called blacks. And then they said, well, okay, the original occupants, inhabitants of the United States, we've been calling them Native Americans, hyphenated Americans. So we will now call you African Americans. And now there are people who are starting to object to that you don't call it white Americans or European Americans. So why should you call us as if, we're a hyphenated American, while the whites are total Americans? Therefore, we don't want to be called a hyphenated American, while the European Americans, you simply refer to them as Americans. So I don't know where it's all going to end. There is going to be a lot of conversation, a lot of debate about this. There will be seminars, university conferences, and so on. And the same thing is going to apply to Britain. Um, what will be the most acceptable, or what terminology will be acceptable to most of those that it will apply to?
Okay, Prof, we'll come back to that point in a second. But I want to put to you some questions that have come in on YouTube. These ones are on YouTube here. And they are going back to a point that we raised a while ago. And this is the idea of concept of medium powers that you proposed at the time. And the comment here is that in light of the present global development, should we be revisiting that idea?
A very valid question. And I think that in the post-COVID-19 world order that we will be building, I think the question quite right. It's not something I had averted my mind to, but now that I'm responding to the question, because it's not going to be a world order with already laid down blocks. People are going to have to think their way through. The Secretary of State of the United States is going around Europe now trying to build an alliance against the Chinese and against the Russians as part of the building blocks for the New World Order. Now, there are going to be countries that say, no, keep us out of this. We don't want to be anti-Chinese and we don't want to be pro-Chinese. And there will not be others who will say, now, we cannot live a new world order that is built on antagonistic alliances. We must now have a mediatory group that is going to keep you superpowers from each other's throat and not subject the rest of us to having to live in a world built on antagonisms. Now, the superpowers are only going to listen to countries that they feel have the capability to influence events, whether in their own area or globally. Well, so medium powers will again come into, because they will listen, they will have the ability of their capability, that their views will command respect. They will command attention. So your question here is right. And I thank him, because I haven't thought that that concept can come back onto its own so quickly after it was abandoned, after I left office as a foreign minister. So hopefully we will have foreign ministers and office holders who will revisit that concept as a useful concept in resolving conflict and building the blocks of the New World Order.
So going back to the point on, and I think we're quickly running out of time here, but going back to the point on race we were talking about before we responded to that question, it seems from again another point that's been raised here that the language that's being used to describe the black race, to describe blacks, is all part of a strategy to keep the black minds suppressed. Do you subscribe to that? Do you feel that the black minds are being suppressed still?
Oh, yes. You've raised a big issue at the tail end of our session today. The intention might not have been to negatively condition the mind of the black man. To me, I think the term black, white were just descriptive terms that were used when people came across each other and they looked so different. Because frankly, the white people are not white. They are slightly brown, actually. They're not white. If you've seen chalk written on a blackboard, you will know what white looks like. Or you are wearing a white shirt. A white man is wearing a white shirt. It doesn't melt into his skin. The same thing for the black people. I regard myself as a black man. And yet we come in different shades. So I think that it is, black became non-white and white became non-black. But they have become offensive now. Politically, they've now been manipulated into becoming offensive racial terms that we are going to have to think our way through coming up with neutral terms. This is not going to be a one-day job or a 1 week or a 1 month, and maybe not even in our lifetime. It may be several generations before we now have a consensus as to what you call Europeans and what you call Africans.
Yeah, interestingly, there's some research here that says the term African American was originally thought to have been crafted around 1835. But in 2016, a researcher found references as far back as 1782. And the question here is this: if the black race don't see the terms as offensive, does it matter? Because they don't see it as offensive until somebody comes along and now says, hang on, why are you being called that?
Well, before Africans, you've raised a big issue. Before Europeans came to Africa, did we even use the term Africans for ourselves? That's number one. Before they now came and we saw that they were white people, did we use the term black for ourselves? Who first called blacks? Did we call ourselves black, or did they call us blacks? If you want really, this is a big issue. We can't discuss it.
We'll come back to this point on another program. But there's a question here that I think we just might be able to squeeze into the 2 minutes we have. Someone here is advocating, I think they're talking about Nigeria here, but the person is advocating the need for a separate foreign service commission.
It's not new. As far back as actually when I was in the institute, and we're talking about 1975 now. I had advocated having a separate Nigerian Foreign Service Commission to oversee an independent and an autonomous foreign service, which will be separated from the home service, as it's done in other countries. There is the State Department, which handles American foreign policy. And then you have the Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, Department of Education, what I would call localized departments, in contradistinction to Department of State that handles the totality of American foreign policy. In Britain, you have the Home Service, which is different and is separate from the Foreign Service. But in Nigeria, the two are merged. And there have been attempts that have been made and fiercely resisted by the Home Service to separate Nigerian Foreign Service from Nigerian Home Service. So whoever asked that question is on the right track. One day we will get there.
We have literally run out of time, Prof. But there is one question here that I have to put to you.
We've run out of time.
I have to put this one question to you, Prof. China used national development planning to achieve its revolutionary technological and economic transformation. How did Nigeria miss it so badly?
We used to have a 5-year developmental program when we became independent. It was abolished in 1975 by when there was a military and they decided to abolish the concept of developmental plans. And that's where we lost it. Because at that time we had 5-year programs, which allowed you to think, to have a vision of where you want to be in 5 years' time. Now we just have a budget that lasts 12 months. And it doesn't allow you to think big.
All right. We want to thank our viewers for joining us today. It's been active across all the channels. Thank you to everyone. There's some questions on Facebook that we could not take, and I'm sure that some of the ones we've dealt with today, we might readdress them looking at some of the questions we have here. Thank you all for joining. Same time again next week, Thursday, we'll be here. Keep the comments going, and thank you for joining us this evening.